Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being with us. Welcome to this starting time of the first of 7 sessions between today and tomorrow. We are starting this morning with a topic which is very important, not only for our industry, but for many industries, related to the ESGs, which I would like to pronounce entirely, meaning environment, social, and governance. These elements are key points for the very best practices in every single industry, especially in our industry. And I am happy to introduce Mr. Wesley Hunt from De Beers, Ellen Mitchell, important consultant with John Key, and Raluca Angel from Natural Diamond Council. I hand over to you, Wesley, and thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy. Thanks a lot.
Good morning, everyone here in Vicenza. I think for those online as well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to the first of CIBJO's seminars. As you can see from up here, it's an ESG model for the jewellery industry. That's what we're focusing on today. And what we really want to do today is share with you a tool which we've been developing over the last couple of years to really help smaller organisations start the sustainability journey. So from our perspective, it's really a chance for us to build on a lot of the work that the RJC have been doing, also from the Watch and Jewellery Initiative, to have another element, another tool to really help smaller organisations move on this incredibly important journey. Now, why is this so important? There's so much more legislation coming up, but equally, from a business perspective, it's becoming more and more vital that people do this. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panellists. As you can see here, myself, I'm chairman of the Laboratory Grown Diamond Committee within CIBJO. I'm also on the board of directors for CIBJO now. From my perspective, we led the introduction of the sustainability. The guidelines really for us was so critical from a lab-grown diamond perspective. It was critical that we had something which stopped people making unsubstantiated claims. So that's why we led the work which we're going to be sharing today. I've had 25 years of experience within the diamond industry and worked in most global markets. And then I'll come on to Helen Mitchell, who we're very lucky to have with us today. Helen Mitchell wrote the guidelines that we're going to be sharing with you today. As you can see here, Helen is an award-winning ESG and sustainability expert. She's worked for 29 years across the globe doing various projects within sustainability. So we feel very lucky to have Helen with us. We also have Raluca Angel, who's many of you will know Raluca. Raluca is, as you can see here, Head of External Affairs and Industry Relations for the NDC. So Raluca is really our industry expert today. Helen's our ESG expert. And then we move on to John Key, who's Managing Director of Key & Company. So when we were looking at who we could work with to really implement this tool, it was actually John Key and all of the work and experience he has within driving projects across the globe who we decided to work with on this particular project. So welcome, John Key. And then last but certainly not least, it's Iris van der Wecken, if I said it properly. I always try and do my best. But Iris, most of you will know as well, and we're really lucky to have Iris with us this morning, who's going to share us some experience and learnings really over the last 18 months with a lot of the work that Iris has been doing on ESG implementation. How do we do this? And all the challenges that Iris has faced, but also the opportunities that come from that as well. So welcome everyone. Welcome everyone in the audience as well. So it's really going to be twofold that we're looking at this morning. This is what we're going to be doing this morning, as you can see on here. The first thing that we want to do is highlight the new and upcoming ESG requirements for companies doing business in the EU. I think certainly when I started this journey and when we spoke to millions of people, well, the hundreds of people that we spoke to on this subject, there was a lot of legislation coming up, but actually that legislation is now with us. And it's really important that we share what that latest legislation is. We're then going to go on to sharing the tool that we want people to sort of use and really start that sustainability journey if they haven't started that journey already. So practically what we're going to do, we're going to try and make this as relaxed as possible, but really give us a chance to go through the key questions that we've been asked over the last 2 years. And these are some of those questions. So we're going to go through with each of our experts here, the questions that you can see on the screen there. And these are the most common questions that we've been asked over the last 2 years. So really by the end of this morning, we're hoping that you'll feel a little bit more informed than when you actually arrived here this morning, and hopefully feel as though you can walk away and start that sustainability journey if you haven't already, but also learn that if you have started it, how else and what else you can do going forward. So without further ado, we'll go on to the first question, and I'm going to ask Helen to take this, our ESG expert. So as you can see here, what does ESG stand for? Gaetano touched on it briefly, but I think it's important just to start from the basics. And why is it more important for businesses in the jewellery industry than ever before? Helen.
Thanks, Wes, for the introduction. Good morning, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here today to be talking about this topic because there is quite a lot of myth that comes with it. And I'm really hoping that we're going to bust a few of those in this discussion shortly. So ESG, as Gaetano said, stands for Environment, Social and Governance. As a business practice, it has come to prominence really in part as a response to global warming and climate change. But one of those myths, those common myths that surround it, that I hear when I work with businesses, is that it isn't relevant to them, and especially smaller businesses because of their scale. So let's consider for a moment that we have had a standardized way to measure the financial performance of a business for many decades. Now, with environmental, social, and governance factors, when combined together, we have the same thing. We have the means to assess and measure the viability and the standing of a business beyond profit alone. So the rise in ESG regulation is in part being driven by the need to create a common language around these ESG factors. It is also because we really need to inject more trust into what companies are saying about themselves and their activities to bring greater consumer protection and also to stamp out the level of greenwashing that we are seeing today. So I'm well aware that that can be quite a daunting prospect for businesses, especially SMEs. But the good news is that there are steps that can be taken now to start getting ready for this regulation.
So then I'll come on to really, I guess, from our perspective, what are the most critical EU regulations that jewellery businesses need to be aware of, even if your business does not yet need to report them? I think this is what we often hear. If you're not listed, if you're not a company which should be doing this, actually for a lot of these, you might not need to report it, but there are some important reasons why you need to start looking at this as well. So Helen, if you could kindly touch on that, that'd be great.
So it's fair to say that there's a fair amount of regulation available today, and there is more coming down the pipe. In the EU, the big hairy beast is the EU CSRD. This stands for Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Now, I imagine that many people here at Vicenza don't necessarily need to comply with all these today. But the important thing is that if you are doing business in the jewellery supply chain, then you are likely to be impacted anyway. So whether you are obliged by law to comply or not. The The CSRD is one of a package of policies that the EU has brought in under the EU Green Deal. That package has a single objective, which is to move the bloc, the European Union bloc, to carbon neutrality by 2050. So because it has this single objective, some of these regulations are becoming linked together. And as an example, with the CSRD, if you have to comply with that, you also have a mandatory obligation to comply with the EU taxonomy, a completely separate regulation. So you've effectively got two in one here. So back to that myth that it doesn't apply to small businesses. So it is a phased approach. It's coming in over a number of years. This is the first year. The large listed companies need to comply. But by 2027, small listed companies will be eligible for this. So that's companies with between 10 and 250 employees and that meets certain financial criteria. So it's an interconnected web. And if, as a business, you don't want this to sit on your balance sheet as a cost, you need to turn this regulation into your advantage. And there are ways to do that.
Thanks, Helen. And I think the other thing which, when I was looking at this, is not just from a legislative perspective, what else is actually driving this change? And I think that's the other key question that I've been asked so many times over the last couple of years. So as you can see here, is there anything significant other than the legislation that is driving this change and rising the importance of ESG? So Helen, if you could kindly touch on that as well, whilst you get some water.
Okay, so let's visit another myth that ESG is just a cost. Actually, there is a strong business case for businesses. There is a body of evidence now that shows the correlation between ESG factors and financial outperformance. If you want to raise money from investors, it is essential that you demonstrate your ESG credentials. If you want to borrow money, it is the same. You only have to Google cancelled M&A deals. So this is your exit argument to see how many have been cancelled because of ESG failures. So the argument is clearly financial, but it is also about customers. So increasingly, customers want to know who they're buying from and where their product comes from. And on here, you'll see there's a range of different research to back this up. And there are when I was preparing this slide, there were two statistics that really stood out for me. So if you are a business in the jewellery value chain and you are doing business with other businesses, so you're a B2B business, 94% of procurement officers are using ESG criteria as part of their evaluation. And here on the left-hand side, you can see some of the examples of those criteria, the typical examples, which are things like your emissions, your diversity numbers, so how many women you have working in your business, and also how are you reducing your carbon footprint. Now, if you are a B2C business, then you can see here that nearly 3/4 of customers would leave a brand or switch their shopping preferences if they felt that the company they were buying from was doing harm in some way. So even if you don't have to comply with the regulation, you probably are going to be impacted by one of your partners or suppliers?
So I'm just going to hand over to Raluca, because actually I think from my side, the question, not just from a business perspective, but actually thinking practically from a trade perspective. What have you seen, Raluca? Certainly, whenever I talk to you, you seem to know more about this world than any of us. So if you could share with the audience a bit more from a consumer perspective.
I live and breathe it.
The elements coming up.
And Helen's introduction was absolutely the perfect leeway into a key point for us. All us here were in the business of talking to people about one of their most personal purchases, jewelry. Whenever you discuss with a consumer, they will tell you or spend at least 10 minutes talking to you about a specific piece of jewelry. That's because that piece of jewelry marked an incredibly important part of their life, whether it's a smaller or larger, but it's still a decision that you've made to associate your brand, your style with that piece of jewelry. Which means that in the way you look at consumers, you need to understand what are those elements that are paramount to them, that are core to their brand, their values. So absolutely, consumers is one of the other key elements that you need to bear in mind whenever you want to whether start developing your environmental, social, governance-related practices or strategies, as well as measure them. Consumers is a vital element that should weigh in your decision to either take on that road or actually fine-tune it, let's say. At the Natural Diamond Council, we talk to consumers 365 days a year. Our main audience is made up of around 35% Gen Z predominantly and 65% millennials. What we've seen is that these consumers are putting a lot of interest and a lot of importance in their own brand, their own style. As I've put there, they are certainly fashion-forward consumers. And equally what we've seen within our audience is that 70% of them, of course we've looked from the perspective of diamonds, 70% of them are incredibly interested in the story of sustainability, the story of the ethics that portray the background of the entire industry. So there is an absolutely compelling case to actually discuss with those consumers and align your values, your initiatives with that of theirs. This is a generation that now above all they're interested in, one, looking at what other influencers are also talking about certain products, as well as they are completely empowered to make choices according to those values. But that, of course, comes at a risk. And the big risk there is greenwashing. And greenwashing is one of the key topics that Helen was mentioning. EU legislation. We can certainly see cases across the world where they're looking into combating this. Why is that? First of all, consumers also get their entire confidence distrusted in a certain product or even industries if greenwashing is being pertained to them. But then above all, they also don't know what products to buy. And for that reason, legislation has come there to protect them and to help them make choices that will actually have a positive impact on the long term. Helen mentioned EU legislation. There are several pieces that have come out that directly impact the way we can actually talk to consumers. So you should not only look at what your strategy is internally, but also what are the tools that you have at your disposal and what you should communicate to consumers. What you see there on the top left is a ban that has come through back in 2024. This is a result of the Empowering Consumer Directive, Empowering Towards Consumer Directive, and that is towards the Green Claims Directive is going to come just after that. But this Empowering Consumers Directive pretty much help them transit towards the green agenda, towards greener purchases, and they have banned the use of generic environmental claims. I'm sure a lot of us have seen such claims out there in the market.
And practically, what does that mean in terms of what now there's a ban, what does it actually mean for jewelry organisations and for those touching the consumer?
Thank you. What that means is, one, you can't make a generic claim. There I took the liberty to address an ad that makes a huge claim for an entire category of products. what EU legislators have come through is that them not being allowed to already make a claim, I'm environmentally friendly, nature's friend, I'm all sustainable, you need to be extremely specific into the claims that you're making. And there is a new piece of legislation that is being negotiated right now. There's the Green Claims Directive, where they come tell you what are the exact measures that you need to take in order to make specific claims, and what you need to prove and implement within your organization. And by the way, all of these are intertwined. Helen highlighted that, and it's very important to keep this in mind. All of these pieces of legislation are interconnected. None of them are going against each other. On the contrary, they help you add brick by brick to the entire green picture that you're creating. So basically, you can't make a generic claim if you can't measure that performance and prove it and publicly disclose it. Then there I took the liberty to just do not even a synopsis, but the top of the synopsis. For me, these were the first most important things for the world of jewelry, because we have seen some examples in this part. You can't make a claim for an entire product if only part of that product falls under those environmental or social requirements. So you can't say sustainable diamonds in this case, for example, if you have a specific part of it that uses renewable energy, but maybe not the whole product gets treated under the same application or measure. So it's very important that that claim is not made for the entire product. You do need to rely on also concrete pieces of scientific evidence and measurement. It's not a quick fix. This is a long-term integration. So looking at certifications and proper certifications that can help your business. For the world of jewelry, of course, we know the Responsible Jewelry Council and the Code of Practices. There you go through entire processes and measurements applied within your company, and the final validation can pertain to confirm and prove key elements of environmental conduct that you should take. Then greenhouse gas offsets, that's something that we've seen reported and covered even under global certification. Now there is very stringent requirement into you disclosing how much of your environmental footprint or reduction is based on carbon offsets, and you need to do it in a transparent way. For example, if you have a carbon neutrality certification, but that's based on offsetting, focus groups and research have shown that consumers actually believe that you don't have any carbon footprint if you're carbon neutral, but that's not a correct affirmation, as that pretty much means you're looking at future offsets that you're trying to reach, but it's not your impact. And last, comparative environmental claims. That's a key point I'd like to draw your attention to. Whatever claims you're making about other products, you need to have the same level of evidence, certification, and requirements as you would for your own product.
Okay. Thank you, Raluca. That's
no problem.
Fascinating stuff. So coming on to the next question, I think it's, again, what is the practicalities of this? I think this sounds like a question which is pretty straightforward for most people, but actually it's one question we get asked more than any other. What does this mean practically for SMEs? And what actually does scope 1, 2, and 3 really mean? And can't I just ignore this? Is there any chance that I can continue to ignore all of these legislation? When will it really impact me? So, Helen, if you could kindly just touch on what the scopes mean and why it is that people can't just ignore this anymore as we go forward, including ourselves.
Yes, sure. Thank you. So bear with me here, because this is where we get a little bit technical. So I'm going to keep it at a high level. So the CSRD requires businesses to report their emissions. And if we're talking about ESG myths, one of a common one that I hear is that I'm too small for my emissions to be relevant compared with another company. But actually under the CSRD, you cannot report comparatively. It's about what your business is doing. So what are emissions scopes? So when you calculate your greenhouse gas emissions, those emissions are categorized in 3 ways. There is scope 1, which is basically the emissions that are generated in the running of your business. So it's things like from the heating, lighting, and cooling of your facilities. Scope 2 are the indirect emissions related to the purchasing of the electricity that you use. And scope 3, which is by far the most complicated aspect of emissions calculations, are the emissions generated in your supply chain and your value chain, so your upstream and downstream value chain. Now, those you, as a business, you don't have direct control over. So it requires a level of collaboration with your partners and your suppliers to get the data that you need to calculate this. What's important here, I think, is that even if you don't have to comply with the EU CSRD, it's very likely that the businesses that you do business with will be asking for your data because you are part of their supply chain. So getting familiar with these terms, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, is really quite important. And it does get easier the more you get used to talking about this stuff and doing the calculations.
That's fascinating. Thanks, Helen. So that was really the big change for me to understand. Even if you don't need to actually report, you'll be reporting because other people will be asking you to give you your data. Okay, so then we come on to what are the priority ESG areas for businesses in the jewelry industry specifically. I know we created these principles really more broadly, but actually what are those most relevant for the jewelry industry, and why is that important for this particular conversation?
So this is where it gets easier. So the foundation of this CSRD is a concept called double materiality. So this is where every business can take and tailor the regulation to their specific operations. So materiality is basically the impact that you and your business has on the environment and on society. For double materiality, it's also looking at how ESG factors in the world impact your cash flow and your valuations of your business. So it's a sort of inside-out view and an outside-in view on your business. Combined, these two, impact materiality and financial materiality, equals double materiality. And the CSRD requires every business to identify the ESG factors that are material to their unique business. So if you think that the CSRD has over 1,100 data points, you definitely don't want to be reporting on all of those. So you assess what is material to you, and then you only report on those. So it is a way of reducing the regulatory burden on your business. It is important to note, however, that CSRD is not just about hard data, your emissions, for instance. It also asks for evidence and descriptions of things like your strategy and how that's integrated into your financial planning, how you have targets and metrics and action plans to reduce your carbon footprint. So there's a qualitative element and a quantitative element.
Thanks, Helen. And I think, again, this really moves us on to the next part of the presentation. So now we've set the scene in terms of legislation coming up, and I think it was quite daunting, certainly when I looked at it myself, but actually when we spoke to more and more people. But I think materiality means that really what's important to your business means that you don't need to do everything. You need to do what's important for your particular business. So then we're going to say to ourselves, what is CIBJO doing to help and support businesses starting on this particular journey? There's a lot of work that's been happening from the RJC perspective, the Watch and Joy initiative, but actually what tool have we come together with to really help small organisations move on this journey who might be a little bit daunted by it? And equally at the same time, I think, Helen, how does this link into the United Nations Sustainability Goals as well?
So getting ready for this regulation is daunting, and it is quite difficult to do in a single step. So the work that we've done with CIBJO is to help making get ready a little bit easier. So last year, we created what's known as the Wheel. It is a set of guidelines with 14 ESG principles designed to help SMEs start their ESG journey and start thinking about the steps that they need to take towards compliance. Can you change the slide, please? The principles include topics such as taking climate action, customer transparency, responsible sourcing, and energy use. It comes with a set of guidelines about how to implement it in your business. It is free to every business to download on the CIBJO website. And it is a particular point of pride for this industry that the Wheel has been presented to world leaders at the UN General Assembly. Here you can see Gaetano giving his speech there. And it's a very clear sign that we're taking this seriously and that CIBJO is here taking these steps to help businesses get ready. So we didn't just stop there. So that was the start of the toolkit last year. And then this year we have developed a set of ESG measurement guidelines for businesses of all sizes, but particularly to help SMEs start measuring their performance. I'm going to now hand over to John, who's going to talk through the details of this guidelines.
Thanks, Helen, and Raluca and Wes. As you probably appreciate, there's a lot to get through today, so I'm going to try and keep the pace going and leave some time for questions at the end. So just to explain what's in here in our guidelines. So as Helen said, these build on the work that we did at the end of 2023 that we presented in Jaipur, which were the principles for action that companies could take. It seeks to focus on common areas. So this is not tailored for one particular sector or company. So although we initiated the work with Wesley and it came out of the laboratory-grown diamonds sector, it's sector agnostic. So it applies to all sectors across the jewellery industry, wherever you are in the world, whatever size company you are, and whichever sector you're operating in. As Wesley said in his introduction, both Helen and I have a lot of experience in other industries, and we've tried to bring that into the jewellery sector when we've written our guidelines, and that would include automotive, aerospace, business services, because industries can learn from each other in implementation of guidelines and measurement. So we've incorporated best practice. What we have is a menu of options. So as Helen said earlier, double materiality is really important here. Companies and organizations do not have to implement every measurement and metric, but if you are implementing measurements and metrics in the jewellery industry, you will find them within our guidelines, and we've structured them in a way that it makes it easy to do so. The work we've done is aligned with the Blue Books and other work within CIBJO. So we've worked closely with John Mulligan. We've been working closely with across sectors within CIBJO to build alignment. As I said, it's sector agnostic, so it applies to everything from diamonds to gemstones to coral, everything in between. We've structured it around the same 14 ESG principles that were in the original wheel that was presented to the UN. We've got recommendations for organisations to measure their own ESG performance, but also get into the supply chain across the scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions, for example. We've got examples, or we've used examples from across the industry, in particular SMEs, because we wanted to make sure that the guidelines were applicable and easy to interpret for SMEs. And within the guidelines, there are simplified recommendations for SMEs. The report is quite long, so what I'm going to try and do is pull out some highlights, and you'll be able to have access to the report in due course.
So I think, John, this was the key element from us. What are the priority areas from an ESG measurement perspective? How are they reflected in the guidelines, really, particularly from a jewellery industry perspective as well?
Yep. So as I said, there's a lot in here in our guidelines, and the double materiality assessment that Helen talked about and prioritization is really important. So what is important to you as an organization or a company will vary across the supply chain. As you do the double materiality assessment, though, you'll find in our guidelines measurements applicable to you. So I'm going to show one example, which is climate action. And for each segment in the wheel, we have measurement areas that are likely to be important to you, either as an SME or a large company. We have metrics and KPIs, and then we have typical data sources, so where you can get the information. And here's one example. This is laboratory-grown diamonds. It's a particular and specific metric that's important to them, which is around energy consumption, which, if people know the laboratory-grown diamond sector, will appreciate is an important one. And the key thing is, within our guidelines, the metrics that are important to you can be extracted. So we tested the guidelines on a number of SMEs. This is Key & Co. Key & Co. sits somewhere within the CIBJO value chain. We are an advisory network. We have consultants and advisors, so we're not miners, but we are an important part of the value chain. And as Helen said earlier, although we're not an SME, we're below the threshold, we will be continually and increasingly asked to report. So as Key & Co. developing the guidelines, we gave the guidelines to Key & Co., the SME, to interpret and use them. And the psychology was quite interesting. It was quite daunting at first, but actually when you get into it, we quickly found that by prioritization and thinking about materiality, we identified 9 areas, 9 important points which we're able to make a start on. And these include things like the carbon emissions from our travel. We're consultants, we travel a lot, and so it's important for us to measure those and think about what we can do to reduce them. And then we did the same thing with other SMEs. So this is SHPRA. We spent time with them in developing the guidelines and then testing them. And what we found was SHPRA had actually taken the original guidelines and were using them as part of their strategy development. They had some ESG goals, which they tailored to the 14 guidelines, the original wheel. They were doing a lot of measurement already, but there were some big challenges for them in continuing on their measurement journey. So bandwidth, they're a small company. How do they find time for this? How do they communicate the importance of it to their employees? How do they work with their supply chain? Lots of challenges. But what we heard from them was that our framework was very helpful and useful for them in overcoming these challenges. And in fact, they asked for further training and more advice on how to continue on their measurement journey. I've got another example here, which is Gemfields. Because of time, I'm not going to talk through it in detail. The one comment I would make is that companies like Gemfields are very advanced on this journey, and they've made considerable progress. And when we spoke to Ed Johnson from Gemfields, who's at the back of the room, it was clear that all the great work that they'd done was very consistent with the work that we'd come. So in a sense, we're not reinventing the wheel here, although we have got a new wheel, but fits with Ed's stuff. So what does the journey look like? And the point of this one is we're all in a different place in terms of maturity. That doesn't matter. The important thing is that we're going on a journey together to improve on how we measure ESG and moving towards greater maturity and ultimately best practice. So you might be just starting on that journey. You might be doing a little bit of measurement. You haven't got into the regulations. But from that starting point, the guidelines are intended to help you to move towards a greater level of maturity in developing those, moving to a more advanced stage, and ultimately moving to best practice.
Thanks, John. And I think the first question that we get asked after going through this detail is, okay, what do I do next? So could you just kindly share what are those key next steps, really?
Yeah, and you're right, Wesley, that's a very common question. So in Shanghai and in Jaipur, when we presented to rooms of people like this, there were quite a few smaller companies in the mid-market or all across the value chain who were saying, this is great, but what do I do next? And how do I get going? And so within our guidelines, we have 10 steps for businesses that maybe aren't as close to this or haven't really got started yet. I'm not going to talk through all of them, but step one is about identifying someone that is going to own this within your business or organization and familiarizing yourself with the 14 principles. And then there are 10 steps that follow that, which you can read in the guidelines that I won't go through now, that make this give you an easy way in to adopting the guidelines. We've also got some next steps and advice for SMEs. So the first one is don't be daunted by the complexity. Familiarize yourselves with the regulation that applies to you. Assign clear responsibility, which is about identifying an owner. Defining the what, so what you're going to measure, which is the double materiality assessment and prioritization. Make it your own. So make sure that you're not doing this as a tick box exercise, but you're using it to drive your company's ESG performance for you. Build on what you've got today. So chances are there are things in your business that you're measuring today that are a starting point for this, and you can build on those. Don't make unsubstantiated claims. So get into the habit of backing up your claims with data and celebrate success, because this is quite a difficult journey. And as you report new things and you develop your reporting framework, celebrate that and look back at the progress that you've made. And then finally, seek help. So there are lots of people out there that have gone through this already in your industry, maybe in your company, in other industries, and also advisors that can support you. So look for help.
Thanks, John. And just one question again, which comes out of all of this is, can you just remind us what size an SME is? And why is that particularly important in this context? Because often people feel as though they can be outside of this. So just remind us again what the size of an SME is.
Yeah, and having worked for multiple businesses and industries, as a lot of us have over many years, anyone that's worked with SMEs will know that this is not a new question. On multiple projects I've done, how do you define an SME is a really important question. And you should look in the legislation that applies to you. So for example, in CSRD, there are some very clear definitions of micro businesses, SMEs, and large businesses, which are actually in the presentation on an earlier page. In there, an SME is between 10 and 250 employees, and there are some guidelines around revenue and assets for the business, and it's very clearly defined. The reason it's important is it will tell you when you need to comply with regulations. So if you're a listed SME under those definitions, it's really important. But to step back, when we wrote the guidelines and the regulations, we're very conscious that, as has been said, this could apply to you as a micro business as well. And so even if you're not an SME, this stuff could be important or will be important. And so we've defined SMEs based on a slightly broader definition, and we used less than 500 SMEs, which by the way is is often a recognized definition in other situations. So whatever your definition is, and check that, our regulation should apply to your business, or our guidelines should apply to your business.
Thanks, John. Raluca.
I just wanted to clarify something that you might be thinking, and that is, of course, all the EU legislation will apply differently according to the size and impact of each company. So don't compare your activity with that. For example, if you have a smaller micro enterprise or a small SME, you will not be asked to report in the same way as an international organization, multinational, but that you can still go through the measurement and through the entire wheel that John has said, and you'll just do it at the level in which your businesses sort of reach out to.
Yeah, it's a great point. And so I'm less, because of my employment structure, I'm less than 10 employees. I use contractors. But I'm asked all the time by clients, what is your ESG policy? What are your emissions? How are you flying? All these kinds of questions are coming to me. And so, which kind of illustrates this point that Raluca's making. There are still things that you may need to do as a smaller business, but I don't need to produce 35 pages in a big annual report. I don't have to measure thousands and thousands of data points. Actually, it's much less onerous on me, but I can make a difference, and it is important to my company as a micro business.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Raluca. So I think just as we move on, John, if you wouldn't mind just moving the clicker on one more. So often we're asked, so who do we reach out to? So from our perspective, you can reach out to Steve Benson, myself, or John Mulligan, who all, from a CIBJO perspective, are looking after this area as best as we can, but working with many, many people across the sphere as well, with Iris, who we're going to ask to join us on the stage in a moment as well. So I think if you want to speak to anyone, please feel free to reach out. But of course, we're going to be here actually all day today. So if you've got specific questions about your own organisation, feel free just to come and ask us. We've got a various array of experts here, so feel free to do that. And I hope this was of use. So John, if you could just move on one more slide. I think our intention was really to give you a bit more information about the legislation coming up, and ultimately provide a tool which any one of us, and I did the same journey as well, how do you learn about this whole ESG picture? What does it mean for your business? And as you go through the guidelines, the idea is that you feel really informed when you stopped reading through these guidelines. So the idea is that you feel informed as a business as we go forward. So I'm going to ask Iris to join us for the Q&A session. So this is the chance. Feel free to ask any questions if you'd like. We appreciate there's lots of specifics around your own business which you might not want to share more broadly, but if there's any general questions, feel free to ask. I think before we go anywhere, the work Iris has been kindly sharing with me in terms of what you've been doing over the last 18 months really fits perfectly into everything that we're talking about here, which is actually how do people implement ESG, what have they been doing, the systems that you've been creating. So I think it would be lovely if you could share what you've been doing, what are those obstacles that people have been overcoming, Iris, in the work that you've been doing.
Thank you very much, Wesley. And first of all, I would like to congratulate you for the fantastic work. And I think the industry is very lucky that this is happening because it's so urgently needed. I also want to first take the opportunity to thank you, Dr. Gaetano Cavalieri, because if we look at the history of the industry, you've always been the pioneer. And we're also very proud to have you as our board member at the Watch and Journeyship 2030. For those of you that do not know us, WGI 2030 is actually quite a young organization that was co-founded by Maison Cartier, delegated by Richemont and the Caring Group. And we ask companies to commit to 3 core pillars: climate resilience, biodiversity, and nature and inclusiveness. And I think it's within that context that the initiative wants to really go on 3 pathways. First is the education pathway, because like you said, Helen, we need to educate the industry, and that's why we work so closely with CIBJO. Second, if you know what you have to do, and that's where regulations come in, the industry used to be very advanced with standards. If you look at the work the RJC did since 2005, all the great work of CIBJO, actually the industry was always pretty much ahead. And I think it's a tipping point now for not just our industry, but for all industries. We need to be really waking up here because the regulations are moving so quickly that this is a risk. And that's why I truly appreciate this work. Second is, once you're educated, you can action. And then finally, you are accountable and to report. And maybe I can show the slide.
I was going to ask if you could share some of the learning curves that you've been through over the last 18 months with the organisations that you've been speaking to.
Yeah, so actually, for the initiative, it's super important to look at all the regulations, so not just these regulations. And so we actually took a pilot group with some of the leading brands like Audemars Piguet, Cartier, Chanel, but also supplier communities to say, let's go on this pathway to understand what are the repercussions of the legislation. And we will be launching in 2 weeks, actually, the results. So we started to discuss with the Commission what is happening now in the legislation and what is coming. And I want to touch upon a few points that Helen said. So Helen, we looked at double materiality. We looked at the link between human rights and environmental due diligence. And we also looked at supplier engagement, because one of the comments that comes out of it is, I'm begging all SMEs to please start the journey, because brands, bigger companies are going to ask the data. And that data is complex. And that means is you need to start understanding and getting the data. So I'm going to try to find a few of those. You asked me, Wesley, to see what were some of the comments that we got. So I think, first of all, on the double materiality assessment, we saw that companies realize that you really need to see what is relevant and material. So there are so many topics, and I think it was also a point that you raised, John and Helen. That means is you need to do it in a multi-stakeholder way. We shouldn't forget, you can't just go out there with this list. You will have to talk to your banks, to your other suppliers, to your service providers. What is also important is that the legislation doesn't talk anywhere about supply chain, but it talks about value chain. So it's not just about your suppliers, it also talks about your service providers, etc. And that makes it an additional component. So we saw that everyone is working on this double materiality assessment, and if you want to do it seriously, you need to do it multi-stakeholder. We also saw that companies are investing a lot in human rights due diligence, but that it's very challenging to connect the dots between human rights due diligence, nature, and environmental due diligence. And it could be you think you're doing fantastic things on climate and nature, and you could be having a major backlash on human rights. So to understand that, it will require additional guidance and communication. And on supplier engagement, we see that actually something has to change. There are too many audits out there, too many duplications, too many lists and self-assessments. And we should not forget, an audit is a momentum. It's a momentum. It could be, and I always think, but what does an audit mean if you've done an audit 3 years ago? Look at how the world has changed. So this means is you need real data, real time. And that's where I believe, for example, this wheel can be a fantastic tool to bring the SMEs on this journey. And I hope that we can work together with the technology that we are working with ESG book, because it will be important not to work in Excels anymore. It will be important to have your own dashboards, and it will be important to not to always have to copy and paste, but to be able to give that data to the wider industry. And finally, I think a final component was that it takes time. It will take time, and that all the companies agreed that education is the biggest priority throughout the supply chain. And that we should also give companies the oxygen to, not go on a perfect journey, but to really be encouraging. Now, in 2 weeks, we will be launching the paper, and the paper will really give detailed guidance of what we learned from those brands. And I thought it was already on its own quite unique that those competitors and suppliers were sitting in the same room with antitrust lawyers, let me be very clear, to be able to look at it. And I'm very proud about this work. And I think together with the great work you've been doing, I think this can bring big value to the business. And finally, we said it for Luca, I always say we're not selling washing machines here, we're selling emotions. We better protect the integrity of the beautiful pieces we sell. Thank you.
Thanks, Iris. So I think one of the things that we've been talking about the last couple of days and even this week was how we can take this forward as a unified group and a task force in doing that with Gaetano and John Mulligan and the team more broadly to make sure whatever work we do is truly aligned and truly integrated, which, as Iris touched on, I think that's what we want to do. So now's the chance for any questions that anyone wanted to touch on in the audience, if there's any. I've had a few questions before we came on stage, so I can touch on those. Any questions in the audience, please feel free to raise your hand. Everyone's being very shy this morning. I'm not surprised. So, a question, Gaetano.
The question actually is to myself. And the question is, why we are doing it? Why all this incredible job asking important people, scientists, researchers with an incredible academic background such as John and Helen, and great experience such as Raluca in her activities at the European community, and obviously Wesley as one of the top representative at the Beers Group, and last but not least, Iris with Watch and Jewellery Initiative, and honestly I am very honored to be part of it in every single sense, and the example that through organization, being all together, CIBJO, Watch and Jewellery Initiative, the National Diamond Council, RJC, World Diamond Council, and so and so and so, together, why we are doing it. We are doing it for a very simple reason, which is complying with our mission, which is, in few words, let the industry grow and flourish and make more money. At the end of the day, what we are all doing is trying to make more money. But, you know, in every game we play, the rules are changing. And the world has had, up to now, and in my opinion will have, extra acceleration in every single process. That means that we have to translate from difficult language to easy language and supply a sort of application, so-called app, in order to go through and choose the options proportionally and accordingly with each size of those who are looking into this possible application. That's what we do. For those who are not aware, you know, considering what specifically CIBJO is doing, representing the rank and files, you know, overall only 7,200,000 companies around the world through our associations. But in the meantime, the fact that we have within the different organizations, you know, organizations such as Watch and Jewellery Initiative, big brands, you saw a list of few of those brands, Richemont, Cartier, Kering, and so and so and so, or World Diamond Council, or other organizations, including those that are specifically going into spreading out, let's say, the verb of what we are doing, such as the initiative chaired by Mrs. Lisa Kennisberg, who is here today. We will listen to her later on. But in any case, that's what we do. And we offer free of charge to the entire industry. I'm telling you, it cost us a lot not only in terms of investment, and I didn't say money, investments, but also great energy and time. So, ladies and gentlemen, I mean, it looks to me that there are no questions, but I felt compelled to ask myself this question, and I hope that considering the answer I gave is a good answer. But please, if you want to ask any other questions, you have the contacts, our website, there are all the contacts. They say, come to us, we will help you at no cost. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gaetano. Thank you, everyone. If there's any final question before we close out. I was going to actually ask one question because I think it's particularly pertinent, and it was asked to me this morning. It was, what will the effect of Trump's presidency have on ESG? So I know it's a big question, but I think it's a little bit of the elephant in the room that we had earlier. I think it would just be interesting, Iris and Helen, if you could just touch on it briefly. If you think, how will that affect things as we go forward? Will it really change things, or will things still continue as they are?
So it is the million-dollar question in a way. You know, we are waiting to see what President-elect, or President from Monday, I believe, will do next. It is possible he will withdraw from the Paris Agreement, withdraw America from the Paris Agreement. But I think it's really important to take this hyperbole in context. So I work with businesses who are, for instance, now have 2 press releases, one for Europe and one for the US, and they are on the same topic, but they are talking in different ways. So whilst action isn't stopping, the language around it is changing to reduce the risk of it becoming a political football. I think if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, vast amounts, billions of dollars went to Republican states. He has threatened to reduce some of that investment, but it is generating some very positive jobs and some investment activities that are unlikely to be rolled back significantly. So I think what you've got is a rhetoric and a language at one level and actual activities at another level. Do you want to add something, Iris?
So Helen, I'm fully aligned with you, and also I have another perspective. So, you know, politics is one thing, but we are confronted every day with a world that doesn't look so great, right? If you look at everything we've experienced, from the hottest temperature to what's happening in California now, to what was happening in Spain and Portugal and everywhere in the world, climate and nature are fighting back. And so we can have the most strangest policies, you know, humanity will have to action and change their behavior different. And I fully agree that will depend on leadership. And I think that's why it's so important that this is a temporary period in history. In 100 years, we will know what that effect was. But I think what I see talking to banking, and yes, you see some really bad news, you know, some banks stepping out or also on ESG investments, etc. But at the end of the day, there'll be again a tipping point. And I'm confident that it will go back on track because the world will show us, you know, you can't fight Mother Nature.
Well, and if I may add that there is a raft of voluntary standards and efforts out there, like the NZAM, which the banks have withdrawn from. But if you think about the consequences of that, you sort of follow the ... and where that ends up. If you aren't adjusting to this new world and this necessity to measure your impact on the planet and on society, what will happen is there will be more regulation put around it. So actually, you know, they are regrouping. They will not go away, but they were changing the way they're talking about it. But actually, it's really incumbent on all of us to do stuff now under our own steam and under the way that it makes sense for us from our cash flow perspective before it becomes a regulation, because there is more to come, and the less we do, the more there will be.
Thanks, Helen. Raluca.
I was going to say, it's always smart to act on the things you can control. So just focus on the elements that depend on you, your businesses, your consumers. Again, I'd like to highlight that what you do is also a reflection of to whom you're selling and with whom you're discussing. So continue sticking to your message. We've seen cyclicity, political cyclicity, economy, and all of the sorts. So just act on the things you can control.
Thanks, Raluca. Did you want to finish, Iris?
No, one point I wanted to say, it's about business resilience. It's about business resilience. If you have manufacturing sites in India, you're not going to think about your water management or chemicals or all these things, you're not going to be fit for purpose. And if you definitely want to serve a brand, you will never be able to do it. And I think due diligence and all of these components will go deeper to product. Management systems are a baseline now. It's going to go to product information, and that requires a whole other level of data. So we better get our act together.
Absolutely. Thanks, Iris. Thank you, everyone, for your time this morning. Oh, one question. Do we have time, Gaetano, for one question? Please.
Thank you very much. Very interesting panel. Buga Berkovic from the Biodiversity Consultancy. So we work on a very specific section of the wheel, the topic, and I just wanted sort of to reinforce what you've been saying. We already see with a lot of SMEs, who are especially suppliers, that they are starting to do things because brands are asking them. So they know they don't have to report on CSRD, but they are asked. And then to reflect on this last, what if policies change? Very encouraging for me is that a lot of them, through this education process that all of you emphasized, started realizing, well, regulations may not catch us, but this actually affects our business. So I'm really, and I'm not a very optimistic person, but I'm really believing that even if the regulations change, companies are starting to be aware that this is a proper way to do business for themselves and for the clients. So we need to keep the roll moving.
100%. Absolutely. Thank you very much. So thank you, everyone, for your time this morning. Thank you for sharing us. I know it's the first session, so have a great rest of the day, everyone. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. The second session is going to start in about 10 minutes. I urge as many of you to stay as possible. In 5 minutes. It's going to feature Mahir Bohanju, standing at the back of the room, who is De Beers Chief Commercial Officer, and who's going to talk about the De Beers program for the industry moving forward.